sugar.
Here's a chance to dance our way out of our constriction.
You're listening to Tackling the Taboo, a journey of self-discovery through Black love. This is part 2 of DJ Duxie and DJ Stilo Max' Journey Through History. Under my voice, you hear Funkadelic, One Nation Under a Groove, off of the so-named album. In this second part of our journey through history, we discuss how we engage in history, study history, and write and rewrite our own personal history in the absence of white colonial influence. Let's get back into it.
One of the biggest reasons why we really don't mess or rock with the education system is because we're being taught a history that does not apply to us. And that's, again, I see it as the ancestors telling us that this does not relate to you because it is not fully telling the full story. And that's why we need to come to, like, going back to Cedric Robinson, how Black Marxism, how he started it off, is he focused on Europe. He didn't start off in the motherland or in the Americas. He started off in Europe because that's the story that's historically told. But he told it from a Black critical viewpoint. He looked at it in this way in which, like, okay, if you guys want to talk about Europe, if y'all want to talk about Europe, let's talk about Europe. And how it's not how you see it, and how this process was extended and applied to those first contacts with folks on the Western Shore.
Mm-hmm. There were always been Black people in Europe.
Yeah. So, just these different ways, right? And again, looking at it like, okay, y'all want to talk about this, let's talk about it, but we're going to talk about it how we want to talk about it. And that's dropping knowledge in the ways in which, it's not us, it's not them and the other, it's not us being the other, it's us telling them, no, y'all were othering each other before you ever othered us. And the ways in which you came to understand your connection to land was very different from how we came to understand it. And the different processes that led to your specific point, time, and place before you had contact with us was very different from how we came to be connected. But there was also undertones of similarities there. Again, if you want to look at European culture and how they celebrate different holidays, and there's blackface to be found in there. But I kind of lost my train of thought. But yeah,
that was all good stuff. I think for me, another way of how I think of all that you just said in terms of like the ancestral connection, and how it's them speaking through us and all that stuff. Another way that I process it, or the metaphor that I use that to process through that as, is like through nature, right? It's like when an animal is born, right? And I'm going to use the animal example, like a caribou, right? When a baby caribou is born, right, it knows how to walk, right, and it knows how to run instinctively. And I think for me, like that, when you were talking about like that surge that you get, like the surge of like critical thought that you get, like initially when you're like, wait a minute, something doesn't add up, right? And so for me, I think of it like when a baby caribou figures out like, oh, like I can run like really fast and really for a really long time on these legs, right? But then it's figuring out like how to navigate like all the different terrain, right? That no two mountain plains are the same, right? Because caribou just constantly travel, right, throughout their entire lives, and that's why I'm using them as an example, right? Because they're rarely in the same place for very long, right? Which kind of would speak to their history, right, and how they would process the world and things like that. Like they're not in a fixed spot, like their home is everywhere, right? And so, the baby is born and it feels its legs, right, for the first time, and it feels, what it feels like to use them. But then, a test comes along, right, when it's maybe, traversing rocky terrain that it's never seen before, right? Or it gets chased by a predator, right? And so, running and playing when it's just you and your family is one thing, right? But when a wolf is chasing you, running and using your legs takes on a completely different meaning, right? And so it's these different things, these different trials that kind of reveal to you who you are, right? And so, like, as you were talking about that ancestral communication, I'm like, yeah, it's how, like, animals, like, they're born with certain instincts, but then at the same time, they learn throughout their life through different trials and interactions that reveal more about what it means to be a caribou, right? Or what it means to be a bird, or what it means to be a whale, right? And so rather than being born into a society with this idea that there's a fixed idea of what you should or shouldn't be, right? Going back to the example of, like, your birth sex, right? And how that we put so much emphasis, right, on example in American culture, on what that's supposed to mean and how we're supposed to perform that, rather than letting a person and their different interactions and tests and trials in life reveal to them who they are, right? That's very indigenous, right? And a lot of, mainstream folks don't know how to handle that, right? Because there's no prescription for it. There's no chart that you can measure this on, right? It's something that you just have to feel innately, right, with a connection with an experience, right, through one another, right? And so that, when I look at history, that's part of the reason why there were so many laws and so much attention about keeping Black folks in America, specifically, during slavery and in post, and Reconstruction, so many laws and so much attention about keeping us away from each other, right? Keeping us away and separated from each other, right? So many laws about, like, us not being allowed to gather, right, and congregate in big places and build up things, right? And I'm looking at a card from our friends at urbanintellectuals.com, and it's a card talking about Black Wall Street, right, from 1906 to 1921, and how this community was basically bombed, right? How basically a bunch of white folks just stormed the area and just burned it to the ground, right? And so while folks like to currently, right, in our present day and time, this may be dating myself, depending on how long this podcast is a thing. But recently and unfortunately, the Cathedral of Notre Dame burnt down, right? And so, of course, there was big outcry, right, because of this big historic loss, right? But then when you think of places like Black Wall Street, where this place was burned to the ground on purpose, right? This wasn't an accident, right? Black Wall Street, in Oklahoma was burned to the ground on purpose. And yet there's no national outcry. There's no, and it goes back to that, the history piece of how you're saying, why we don't gel with the education system, the public, the mainstream education system, right, is because, if we even hear about stuff like this, right, it's never in the context of taking responsibility for white supremacy and white terrorism, right? It's always from the stance of, like, oh, this terrible thing happened, but look how resilient they are, right? It's never, the white community taking, that kind of reflection, right, on this is who we are, right, and this is what informs this past, right, these actions toward things like Black Wall Street and redlining and whatever, right, these actions inform now who we are, right, the intergenerational memories that get passed down, right, this informs who we are, and that's where, a lot of folks get messed up. But that's kind of an example of how we come to this same place, for example, UCSC, how we come to the same place, but very, very different narratives that inform how we come to this place, and that then thus influence, what is revealed about ourselves, right, through these different experiences with other people, right, and why it's important, for us as Black folks in America to get together on a regular basis, some kind of regular basis, right, is to reignite that, right. That's what they didn't want us to do back in those times, right, is to reignite all that at the same time, right? Because once you get all that energy flowing at the same time, right, like who knows, right? That's what built our societies back in the day, right? It's all of us together in whatever respective societies we come from, all of us together pulling together with that common goal and understanding, right? And evolution, right? That what we are today may not be what we are tomorrow, but because of our connection with the land and how the earth works, it's constantly changing, right? The earth is never fixed. And so this idea that our identities are fixed is, to me, kind of like, restrictive. I think, it doesn't spark any imagination, right? Because the earth as we know it today, just looking at, I guess, global history, in this regard, when you look at a map of the world, like we come with this, we look at it with this expectation that that's what the continents are going to look like for now and eternity. Right. It's not what they're shifting as we speak. And so if we as a human species are no longer in a place like where we're training ourselves to adapt with that, right, then, we become history, right? And so in order to not do that, right, for me, it's about, again, reconnecting with that natural part of it, right? So that's why, I mentioned the caribou at the beginning, is because it's reconnecting with creatures and organisms who have been living on this planet a lot longer than we have, as humans, right? And I think that's what was part of our success as Black folks, pre-colonial days, was that connection, because we were all connected to some sort of animal, right? In every culture, right, there was some kind of sacred animal or animals, right, group of animals that were sacred, or were for inspiration or for certain ceremonies, right? And I think, right, that is because animals themselves have learned, about the planet and how it works, and teach us, right? Like they're teachers to some degree, and so to a big degree. And so, yeah, when I think about my identity, what it means to be Black in America right now, and all those layers, right? I think like the hybridization for me is like knowing where the ancestral voice comes from, but then learning and connecting to the land I'm on right here, right? And making an identity out of that.
Blood will flow, flesh and steel are one, drying in the colors of the evening sun. Tomorrow's rain will wash the stains away. Something in our minds will always stay. Perhaps this final act was meant to cinch a lifetime's argument. Nothing comes from violence, and nothing ever could. For all those born beneath an angry star, lest we forget how fragile we are. On and on, the rain will fall like tears from a star, like tears from a star. On and on, the rain will say how fragile we are, how fragile we are. On and on, the rain will fall like tears from a star, like tears from a star. On and on, the rain will say how fragile we are, how fragile we are, how fragile.
Herbie Hancock and Esperanza Spalding's interpretation of Fragile. You're listening to Tackling the Taboo, A Journey Through History, Part 2.
Yeah, I guess what I'm caught on definitely is that the global history part. Like, we also need to come to understand, because the planet, as we know now, is dying if we don't do something, and we need to come to look at what led to that, and that's a lot of capitalism that did that, and the ways in which capitalism was constructed in relation to the motherland and to the Americas, and how it's intertwined with these systems of exploitation, extraction, and racialization of black folks and indigenous folks and these different identities who we now, would generalize as being people of color. Japanese, Filipinx, these different identities, and how the ways in which what folks like to call the global north, the ways in which, or the quote-unquote Western world, came into, the quote-unquote third world, or just these different continents and countries, and extracted resources while dividing and exploiting them and racializing them and killing them. Because even in colonialism, there was in Belgium, the folks, what we now know as Belgium, when they came to the continent, these different European nations, when they came to the motherland, they had some way, shape, or form of enslavement of Africans in the motherland before that system had to switch a little bit. But initially, it was a form of enslavement, and it was also just a form of very cruel and inhumane things, where they would amputate children, and they would execute different folks, and extracting these resources, and then they would take it back to to their nations and that are already industrialized, and speed up this process of global warming, because everything that was brought about was because of these industrial nations. But a lot of the policies are put on non-industrialized nations who have not done any of this, unless the work is outsourced to them, and there's factories which are now being put in them, because capitalism is always finding a way to continue to exploit for people. So when you look at these quote-unquote first world countries, or these industrialized countries who were now forced to implement labor laws and fair labor laws, whether they abide by them is another story, as we can see with today's strike that I mentioned. But these labor laws, so there's this push to go, again, as many Marxists describe it, for capitalism to always be expanding, so it goes back to the nations that it's extracting sources from and implements these different factories, or puts multinational corporation buildings there. And just the ways in which that comes to kind of erase or divide or separate us from initial connections or understandings of how we connect to the land, and how that affects global warming. Because folks talk about there's a lot of black activists who talk about, or who folks who are down for liberation, but they don't conceive it fully, at least speaking from the eye, in that they say, yeah, liberation, but we're still going to keep capitalism, or they see black capitalism as the save-all, be-all. But that's not the case, because capitalism is also intertwined in how the planet has been killed and is now dying. And so to fully understand the liberation is to fully understand that how we come to understand our relationships to work, success, comfort, stability, and the land is all something that we've been socialized and conditioned to be. Just how in pre-colonial communities they were socialized and conditioned to understand the land, how they did it, but it was not in a sort of a forced way. It was just, again, this geographical knowledge and this very, very more intimate connection to different things. Not to romanticize these communities, because there was definitely large kingdoms here and there who understood things not in such an intimate way in connections to the land. But again, it wasn't under these capitalist processes. So yeah, just going back to understanding global history also in connection to global warming, because global warming is also a form of racial injustice when you look at the processes that led to it, and the regions that are being affected by it the most, which are underdeveloped or non-industrialized regions, or nations who just aren't being helped, such as Haiti after the hurricanes, even parts of the United States, like the 6th and 7th wards of Louisiana, the 7th ward specifically, which is predominantly black, who is still not being helped.
Flint, Michigan.
Flint, Michigan. Just these different predominantly black communities that are not being helped and are being affected not just by global warming and the effects of it, because I'm pretty sure predominantly white and gentrified communities, it's actually known when the voices of the gentrifiers are being expressed, that's when things get done. That's when renewal projects and quote-unquote have you are being put, but they're also displacing folks of communities who were indigenous, such as black folks who are find themselves indigenous to predominantly black or historically black communities. Once they're gentrified, they're displaced because the voices of gentrifiers get heard, but they get heard and things are done in the ways in which the gentrifiers want it to be done. So that means kicking folks out when folks who had been there for the longest time were saying the same thing, but nothing was getting done. So it's, again, looking at these ways in which processes are favoring and ignoring different folks, as well as just universally affecting the globe, and coming to understand it again in, like, this is the history, this is what's been done, and this is how we need to understand the future for it. We need to understand ourselves, embracing ourselves and our ancestry, and reimagining this, reclaiming it, redefining it how we want to, in the absence of capitalism, in the absence of these racializations, in the absence of these divisions, and these very heteronormative, Eurocentric ways of understanding our relationships to work, success, stability, even knowledge, or even intellect, and then just relationships to the land and ourselves, because we are very conditioned to be individualized. But there's nothing can ever get done, as again, history has shown. Civil rights, black liberation movements, workers' rights movements, just these different things. While history loves to, very Eurocentric history loves to idolize just one key figure, Martin for civil rights. In terms of black liberation, they're not idolized, but they're pinpointed as being Angela Davis, Kwame Ture, Malcolm X. Workers' rights, Cesar Chavez is always a name that's thrown around. It was never just them. Martin didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to start a movement. He was brought in by different organizations that were already planning the bus boycott, these different actions. Malcolm found himself reading the readings of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, and then found himself in the Nation of Islam being a prominent speaker in the Nation of Islam, and then himself leaving the Nation of Islam because of the issues that can be found within the Nation of Islam, misogyny, heteronormativity, and it's a political movement that politicizes Islam, and not to speak for Islam because that's not a religion I have, but like they're taken different workshops, the ways in which even different sects of Islam like to call themselves the correct way of doing Islam, and how Orthodox Islam likes to do that. So just acknowledging that, and how Malcolm saw that the ways in which the Nation of Islam was doing things was different from how he came to understand it, and also just different divisions, because when he went to Mecca, when he went back to the motherland and to these pilgrimages, he saw that it was very different faces of folks who identified within the religion of Islam. It wasn't just how it had to be, and there was different denominations, or I'm not sure if that's the proper term, but different forms of believing in Islam also present there. So he came to understand that. But again, that was him in interactions, human interactions, rhythms of human interactions with other folks. So, and then going back to the workers' rights movement, Cesar, again, didn't wake up one day and say, we're going to do this and that. And then Cesar himself had very problematic things in that he saw the workers' rights movement, the farm workers' rights movement, as being for documented farm workers, not undocumented farm workers, in which he was throwing the same racial slurs that white people were throwing at undocumented folks, because he saw them as union busters, but in reality he did not come to understand the solidarity he needed to build with the undocumented folks, because they themselves were facing the same, if not worse, forms of exploitation and dehumanization that documented farm workers were facing. But again, these movements came about through different interactions, rhythms of human interactions with different folks that in turn forms a community, and goes back to, again, geographical knowledge. Black liberation in Chicago was different from black liberation in Northern California. Just like how black liberationists in the South came to, more specifically SNCC, how SNCC came about. SNCC was how the name Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They started off nonviolent and very moderate, but as their interactions with white quote unquote allies, and their interactions with the government, and how the government was very reluctant to give them certain things, they were more the Democrats, especially Kennedy and Johnson, they were more inclined to say, we'll give you voting right campaigns, because when you mobilize folks to vote and you see the party that's doing it, that's just getting the Democrats to vote. It's not really about getting black folks what they want. It's about getting the Democrats what they want. So it's, again, politicians doing political things, right? And so just these different, again, interactions with different groups, different individuals came to form this knowledge, this geographical landscape knowledge that SNCC again, in different chapters, but as a collective, when they met in this convention, came to understand and they came to realize, well, no, that's not what we want. And what we want is very different from what these interactions have given us. And that's why Kwame Ture said Black Power for the very first time. And you could see the reactions to that point to why he even said it in the first place. When he said Black Power, he said that the white liberal response was, no, wait, what about us? And no, wait, that's radical. Where the response that he needed or wanted to be expressed was, okay, Black Power, what do you need us to do? As white folks, what do you need us to do to not bring about, because that's white savior complex, but to help you wherever we can help you, bring that, so you can bring that. How can we support you? Not how can we bring that for you. It's how we can support you in that fight. Because Black liberation and civil rights was by Black folks, for Black folks. And then the different intersections within that, queer and trans Black folks who were marginalized in these movements historically, and, just Black women who often are sidelined, especially Coretta Scott King in the civil rights movement. Her work is often denied. And then Claudette Colvin, who was known to be even one of who was known to refuse to get away from the front of the bus before Rosa Parks did it. And then different Black women who had done the same thing, and different Black men as well who had done the same thing. Again, going back to this individualization. So just the ways in which Black women are sidelined, but also focused in very kind of demonizing ways, but also individualizing ways. When you look at Angela Davis and the ways in which she's kind of like idolized as being the spokesperson for Black liberation, when in reality she was just part of a series of groups for a time, the Black Panthers, historically with the Black Liberation Front, and just herself as being a Black critical theorist, and the ways in which she views it, and then how she is, intellectually and I'm not sure if practically is the right word, but putting these theories and intellect into practice in prison abolition and in the liberation of Palestine from being occupied, right? So when we come to understand this, and ourselves when we come to understand our own intellectual understandings, it's never just us as an individual, oh, well, I just came to think about this, or I came to theorize it. It's the ancestors providing us with these forms of critical thought and like helping us process this, but it's also our different rhythms of interactions with different folks in different spaces, who themselves come to understand things very in different ways, in similar ways when they interact with one another. And again, it's about building community. Also, again, just say that liberation is never going to be individual, and it's never going to be under capitalist ways of thinking. It's going to be around whether it's a redefinition and reclamation of pre-colonial ways of doing it, and we just redefine it to apply it to how we want to think of it, or it could be something completely different, more Afrofuturistic, where it's what we know to be the past, the present, and the future, all interconnected with one, because we understand that they don't live independent from one another.
You're listening to Tackling the Taboo, a journey through history, part 2. You hear Janelle Monáe with her song Tightrope off the album The Archandroid, taking us through this next transition back into DJ Stilo Mac and DJ Dubsy, continuing their discussion about finding our place in the broader collective narratives of our society and the earth. Please keep listening.
I'm gonna
Yeah, one thought that comes to mind, right, as you're talking about the rhythm of human interactions, right, and essentially how history is created through that, right, and how I see that as a way that we kind of create our personal history as well. And then also as a way to inform how we want to, participate in history. And so I think of the end of a recent film that I saw. I won't, don't want to get into any copyright stuff like that. Let's just say it was a Jurassic something, and at the end of this film, what happens? Spoilers alert. What happens is that this little girl finds out that she's actually a clone of her mother who passed away, right? And her father, who she thought was her grandfather, right, made a clone of her, right, and was raising her, right? And so at the end, it's her and then the two main characters, the leading man and the leading woman, and the dinosaurs that were extracted off the island, and they were in this big mansion, and the mansion was burning down, and like some chemicals had gotten released or whatever, the smoke was gonna suffocate them all, and so they broke out of their cages, but there was this big garage door that they were trying to bust out of that they couldn't bust out of, right? That had to be opened by a button. And so the leading man and the leading woman are standing there, and they're just like contemplating the moral turpitude. I don't know if that's the right word, but it just sounds right. They're just contemplating like all the moral ramifications of pressing the button and letting them out, or not pressing the button and letting them die, right? And it's so funny because the leading man, they're both white. The leading man eventually like leans back on like essentially, quote unquote, the Constitution, right? The policy, like the thing that says like, oh, we can't let these creatures out here because blah, 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 and the other policies, ramifications, whatever, right? And so, because the leading woman was like standing with her hand over the button. She was getting ready to press it, right? But then the leading man was like, no, we can't, policy, bull crap, right? And so then the animals are like breathing in the smoke. They start to, drop to the floor and all this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, the door opens, right? And it cuts to the little girl with her hand on the button, right? And the leading man and leading woman are both looking at her like, like WTF. And she goes, because, she opened the door to let the dinosaurs go out into the night and start, killing people. But they look at her and, with the look of like, why did you let these dinosaurs out into the world? Because if you know the story of Jurassic or whatever, the dinosaurs were cloned and brought back to life, right? And so the little girl simply says, right, they're alive like me. Right. And so that moment throughout the whole film, like I wasn't expecting much to it. I just went to go see the CGI dinosaurs. That's all I went to see. I wasn't expecting much of the plot until that moment. Right. When she releases them and says they're alive like me, because she was a clone. She found out she was a clone. They were clones. They're two completely different species. But she, in that moment, connected with that story. Right. That they came into this world under similar circumstances, even though we live very different lives. I live my life as a human. That dinosaur lives its life as a triceratops. We live very different lives, but like we connected around this idea that like we were both brought here against our will, right? Or we both ended up in this situation against our will. And so, I'm going to press that button and let y'all outside because you're alive like me and I don't want to die. And the reason the leading man and leading woman couldn't do that is because they didn't have that connection, or they couldn't find it within themselves to empathize with those creatures, right? They empathize with policy more so than with the creatures, right? With the living beings. And so, I think, when we think about like how history is written and enacted in a lot of ways, right? It's especially in mainstream white Western culture, right? It's this very constitutional stance, right? No pun intended, or pun intended actually. You're right. It's this very much, leaning on this constitutional rhetoric as if, it was handed down, from the gods themselves. And so there's this idea, right? I keep going back to the idea that, right, like they're alive like me, right? And so when it comes to, thinking about Black liberation, right, that, for myself and for the people within, my community, right, they're are so many of us that, on the surface may look the same, but may, come to understand who we are in very different ways, right? And so, again, that's why I think it's very important for us to come together and practice what it feels like, playing that rhythm of human interaction, right? Because the more we play that out, the more we see how fluid and how cyclical life and time is, right? That we always come back to these things. It's fluid, right? It's not fixed, right? But at the same time, certain things carry on and come back and recycle, right? And so, I think that for me, right, that's how, another way that I engage with not just my history, right, but then understanding that there are people who look like me throughout the world who have a different history around how they came to be, right? And all that connects with, going back to the quote from the movie, right? They're alive like me, right? And so, that's where for me then comes the idea that, Black liberation does not mean white extinction. Right? Like, just to say that explicitly. And so I think, that's such a misconception, and that's such a rewriting of history, right? A misrepresentation of what it really is, right? Because in order for my Blackness to exist, it doesn't mean that everybody else has to lose on it, because it was existing long before, everybody we were all just doing a thing, right? And so, so in this setting too, right? That me wanting to live my life in a way that where certain things are present or not, but I get to choose those things, right? And I'm not socially obligated, right? And that doesn't have to come as a result of violence, right? Or anybody losing anything. It's a result of my own, what I want to choose to personally lose or gain, right? But yeah, it doesn't have to come at the cost of an entire existence, an entire society being wiped out, that there is a such thing as coexistence, right? And again, it goes back to nature and animals, right? And ecosystems, that all these different species coexist together in the same area. And it's not perfect, but it all keeps the system running.
Now we got a revolution, 'cause I see the face of things to come. Yeah, your Constitution, well, my friend, it's gonna have to bend. I'm here to tell you about the destruction of all the evil that will have to end.
Thank you for listening to Tackling the Taboo, A Journey Through History, Part 2. We hope you enjoyed our stream of consciousness approach to this historical conversation. Certainly this will not be the last time we talk about Black history in any context. Look out for our next episode, brought to you in part by the Pi Psi chapter of Delta Sigma Theta here at UCSC, who hosted an event entitled Black Boy Joy. Here's a preview.
Because we do understand the struggles of being a Black man, not only just on this campus, but in the world right now, and how hard it is. So we threw this event to reaffirm them and their Blackness and show them that, like, we give them the same amount of love as we do our Black women and our Black queer folks.
Once again, that was a preview from our next episode entitled Black Boy Joy. Nina Simone and her song Revolution from the album Forever Young, Gifted, and Black, Songs of Freedom and Spirit, will play us out. Till next time, stay Black and lovely.